Okay, so a little over a week later, I am now or I am now picking this series back up again, looking at the soccer case that we've been discussing and expanding on, and so on. We so far have created the sponsor, the team, and the game table, and I went ahead and I created all the other tables and even filled them with some data. So I just wanted to show you what I ended up coming up with and talk about some of the key points. You will notice that a couple of things that I don't normally do have been done here, sometimes in an effort to educate you on some of the additional features of SQL, and sometimes just because when I generated this data or generated these create table statements from the database, it throws in a little bit of extra, and I didn't want to take the time to remove it just to keep from confusing. We already know what the difference between not null and null is. This is just explicitly saying so. We know about what all the data types are, so I'm not going to go over them individually. I will just talk about the things, the key points, and touch on some things that we haven't talked about for a bit. For example, when we're creating an identity field, we can omit this brackets 1, comma 1, and it will mean the same thing as 1, comma 1, which means that our first record that it attempts to create in this table will have an ID of 1 in this player ID field, and then it will add 1 for each successive record it attempts to create. And we also have to keep in mind that the identity specification isn't foolproof, and occasionally when errors happen and so on, there are times when it'll skip numbers, so we can't depend on the number being sequential. Okay, so we have typical player contact information or person contact information. We have the first and last name, some contact information, phone number, date of birth, and then we have a team ID here. This is the foreign key column, and that alone will tell us what team a player belongs to, but we also add on this foreign key constraint to make sure to keep the person honest, whoever's inserting this data, and make sure that they don't make any mistakes. We can keep the mistakes from happening by making sure that we have the database looking at every insert into this player table and saying, hey, does that team ID already exist in the team table somewhere? And if it doesn't, it'll spit back an error, so no data ever got inserted. Possibly skipping an identity number, since we happen to be talking about that a moments ago. Okay, so we know what a primary key is all about. We know what a foreign key is all about. We just got to remember what our naming convention is. So just like with any other constraint on our table, we start it with a prefix talking about what type of constraint it is. So in a primary key we say PK, and in a foreign key we say FK. Then we give it an underscore and say which table it belongs in. Player, same thing with the foreign key. And then we give it another underscore talking a little bit more about the specifics of that particular constraint. For example, here we're saying player ID is we're saying the primary key is on the player ID field. Here we're saying FK player, well, we might put it on the team, I don't know, team ID, we could say, if we wanted to change that up a little bit. But typically we would just put the other table. It's sort of a convention that comes automatically with Microsoft, and a lot of people in the industry do observe it, so we might as well. Then in a foreign key we talk about the name of the table over here, the name of the field over here, team ID. We're saying that this is the one we want to put the restriction on, and the restriction will be that it has to reference the team table's team ID. On that DBO is just a leftover. I didn't delete that when it generated the code. So the point table is a little more complicated than you might think it is offhand, because number one, I added in a couple of neat features that we haven't really talked about in the course as yet, so I just wanted to touch on them and give you a heads up as to some of the things you can do with databases. SQL in general cannot do everything, but it can do a hell of a lot more than we've really dealt with. So let's look at what these things are. Okay, so we set up our ID, what part of the game that a point is scored in. Then over here we have this point goal ID field. Now if we look back at our diagram, point goal ID is a foreign key that says that a point may or may not belong to another point, in which case the belonging or the child point is an assist and the parent point is a goal. So the child, the assist, will have a point goal ID field. And I'm kind of regretting naming it that way. In fact, I kind of feel like I wish I had called it just plain goal ID. But unfortunately, I am already committed to it because I've created data and everything, so we have to leave it as is. But this here is kind of like a point will put its hands up saying, I am an assist if this field has a value, and we know that means not null, right? So if it's null, then it's not an assist. I'm an assist if this field has a value, and the goal for which I assisted has this ID. So that's what the goal or the point goal ID means, the one that I wish I had called goal ID. Now, the player ID is, I'm still a point, but this player, the player with this ID scored this point, and this point was scored during the game with this ID. So you see how these foreign key values all work, right? But if somebody were to accidentally put in a value that didn't exist in one of these other tables, we also have these constraints as backup. These are our protection against human stupidity, because, well, no, not even human stupidity. Sometimes it's just a slip of the finger. Sometimes a very intelligent person can make a simple mistake, and we have our databases in place that can guarantee that those mistakes don't pass through. Right, so that's cool. Now, what are these things here? What are these two constraints, these check constraints? Well, what happens is a check constraint is run when you try to insert, update any information with in this point table, and a check constraint is triggered the same way that a foreign key or primary key constraint are triggered. It's just something that happens whenever an insert happens to make sure that the data fits a certain set of rules. And this is one of the checks that happens. We're going to say, well, let's check that the point half. Notice again, we follow the same format. With prefix that talks about what type of constraint. This is a check constraint, is what it's called. Then an underscore, and then the name of our table, so point. And then an underscore and some kind of description of what makes this check unique in this table. And in this case, we're making a check against the half, which is our half, which can be the first half or the second half of our game. Well, that's why we want to make sure that our half doesn't go any higher than 2 and doesn't happen to be, 0 or a negative number or something like that. It's a tiny int, so it can't be a negative number, but if it were an int, that's kind of helpful as well. But our point half, we say that it's going to be greater than or equal to 1. So it can't be a 0, it can't be a negative 1. And it'll be less than or equal to 2, so it can't be a 3, 4, 5, etc. So it's allowed to be 1, it's allowed to be 2. Your check constraint can have just about any true or false expression that we can use, for example, in our where clause, in our on clause, and so on. Same thing applies over here with our point time. We're going, well, check that our point clock time is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 45 because we're having 45-minute halves in our soccer game. And up here, we've done defaults before, but this whole convert time, this convert function just takes the second argument and changes it into a data type by parsing or whatever it takes into the data type that we put in our first expression. So there, now you have kind of an overview of all this stuff that's going on in point. We already know, like I said, how most of this stuff works. It's just we're adding a little slight bit more complication on top of it to make our database do more of the work for us, to make sure that all of our data is consistent and dependable and reliable and whatever other words you can come up with. All right, then we got to add some more people, our coaches and our guardians, keeping in mind that if we look at our diagram, let's just scroll through and get rid of all these extra bars. Our guardian and our coach are are just people, and they don't depend on anything, but there are tables that depend on them that we couldn't create until we had them made first. So we're going to make the coach, we're going to make the guardian, and then I come in and I make the player guardian. Notice that player guardian, this guardian type that I spoke of before, is here. And again, I made the mistake of using the wrong field name, or a bad field name, or a name I don't really like all that much. But I'm committed to it because I've already added it to the database. You know, too late, too little, too late otherwise. Anyhow, I am looking at a compound primary key. That's something that we've talked about before as well, because our player guardian table is a single relationship between a guardian and a player, because a guardian and a player are not going to have multiple relationships to either father and son, or father and daughter, or I don't know, cousin. You know what I mean? Whatever the case is, whatever that relationship is, they're only going to have that one representation in our database. We don't need to say this is somebody's son and that same person is somebody else's son again. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. So we allow a dual primary key to say this player and guardian ID do not exist together, do not occur together in this table more than one time. And that's what makes this record unique. Whenever we want to find out something about it, we look for the player and the guardian, and we'll know that we're looking at the right place. Same idea with team coach. A team can have multiple coaches, and a coach can coach on multiple teams, and that's just the way it is. And the team coach type, I set it to H or A, meaning head coach or assistant coach, so I defaulted it to H. And that's it. We're done talking about that bit. Hopefully that wasn't too much. You can skip over this. I probably should have said that at the beginning, but maybe I will go over and put a note in there. Anyhow, yeah, so we're going to go on to looking at the data and doing some queries.